Attending today. Thank you, John, Terrence, Justin, and at one point Michael for setting the stage for us to have such a great talk. I'm very happy to have all of you here today. My name is Nick, PhD candidate here at McGill, and it's been my pleasure to be coordinating the STandD speaker series with Carmen, who is also in attendance. So yeah, this is talk number 6 out of 8 so far. We'll be kind of giving brief little summaries of the talks coming up later on. We'll communicate about that. So little reminders for the other talks, but let's focus on today. So today we have a talk with Dr. Greta Semplici. I've been very much looking forward to this for a few months now. Dr. Greta Semplici is a Max Weber Fellow at European University Institute, Florence, Italy. She earned her PhD from the Oxford Department of International Development in Oxford, UK. She holds a master's degree from the University of Florence in Development Economics and International Cooperation. She has extensively worked in the development sector for international organizations, relevant think tanks, and research programs. And her research interests lie at the interface between development questions, society, culture, and the environment. She's worked on resilience, social protection, livelihoods, pastoralism, and mobility. I had the pleasure of meeting Greta in person at the CASCA IUAES Joint Intercongress that was held in Ottawa in 2017. And I also met her in the context of a Commission for Nomadic Peoples event which Saverio, who is also in attendance here today, had organized. So thanks to both of you for having been there in Ottawa, so that I could meet you. And here we are a few years later, meeting again virtually. So it's really a pleasure and an honor. And I've got nothing but good things to say about Greta, because we had a very lovely chat in Ottawa, and then she's again made me happy because she graciously accepted my invitation to come speak today. So I hope that all of you enjoy this talk, and without any further ado, I yield the floor to Greta. So Greta, the show is yours. So thank you very much. Have fun.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone for attending. Yes, indeed, when we could travel and go to IUS and meet in person, that felt a long time ago. I am sharing my screen, and you should be able to see it, right? Okay. So I'm also setting a time and have a look. So yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for attending this session. I'm very excited. My name is Greta Semplici. As Nika said, I'm a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, as well as a postdoctoral researcher under the pastoralism, resilience, and uncertainty project, also hosted in between the University of Sussex and the EUI. And I'm also an external co-investigator of a smaller in size, but with great ambition, project called Reimagining Development for Mobile People, including mobile pastoralists, but also other peripatetic groups of people, hosted by the Refugee Study Center at the Oxford Department of International Development. And today, as Mika said, I will present my PhD thesis, which was discussed a year ago at the Department of International Development in Oxford, and I'm reworking it into a book monograph. So I'm kind of using this opportunity to do a sort of book workshop or something, like testing ideas, the format, and maybe having some advice also on possible university press, which might be interested. I have few in mind, but I'm still exploring the editorial landscape. And also, let me say that is the first time I do something like that, like long presentation over the whole thing, book workshopping. So bear with me if there is room for improvement. In particular, what I thought to be doing, if I can move the slide, yes, is to start by summarizing the key arguments so that they are at least clear from the beginning and won't get lost in the next hour presentation, more or less. And then I'll move to explain the rationale and objectives behind the study, the overarching framework and research questions which led the study, and then I'll briefly go over some of the main themes of the monograph to be, so namely the environment, livelihoods, and cultural identities as elements for a reformulation of resilience thinking in international development. Okay, so the monograph I'm working on, as I mentioned, is based on my PhD thesis, and it draws on long-term field work with in Turkana County with Turkana herders in northwest Kenya as an entry point for critically engaging with theories and practices of international development, and in particular about this notion of resilience. In this regard, it introduced a new analytical framework, let's say, to understand resilience, challenging the prevailing development wisdom which defines resilience restrictively, in my opinion, through bouncing analogies, bouncing backward, bouncing forwards, while the book shows that variability and uncertainty are key elements of society and the environment. So to reflect on such messiness of the surrounding, let's say, the book proposes mobility as the analytical lens to understand resilience through practices of navigation employed to interface the variability of the lived context. In doing so, I draw from a broader understanding of mobility, yes, as movements, but also as connections and fuzzy identities, with the goal as well to articulate an alternative narrative of mobility away from crisis or coping that more dominantly characterize policy narratives in pastoral or non-pastoral sectors alike. While by employing approaches from the mobility paradigm, the book shows mobility as a curated everyday experience which brings change. New customs, new skills, new tools, new relationships, new values, new identities, and in turn, it creates the possibility for innovation and resilience. I hence argue for a reconfiguration of the notion of resilience as capacity for change, entailing open-ended, flexible, dynamic interactions with variability and uncertainty, hence avoiding homeostatic assumptions that an idealized state of stability should or can be restored. And I build this argument from the observed capacities of Turkana herders to craft and recraft, maintain their livelihoods open and attentive to changes in society and the environment, and to reflect the uncertainty and variability of the surrounding in their decisions and practices. So the rationale and objectives, what motivated me. And basically, I was drawn into a paradox of representation, as scholars portray pastoralists as one of the most resilient groups, perhaps not uniquely, but is one of the most frequent claims in the pastoralist scholarship, while practitioners, on the other hand, often see them as the most vulnerable one and hence in need of support. Thus, initially, with my research, I intended to explain how there could be such different viewpoints and to bridge the divide. Indeed, resilience has reached great popularity in policy circles, including the development and humanitarian sector, where we can talk of a proper resilience turn in given the scale of application of the concept of resilience in much recent programming, as well as in terms of key organizational changes at the level of new resilience councils, resilience centers, networks, working groups, etc. And in the development sector, resilience is largely employed by mobilizing discourses on the sustainability of systems, by withstanding, recovering from, adapting to disasters or impending shocks. And despite, or let me say, perhaps because of such great popularity, the usefulness of the concept remains debatable, and the term itself is highly contentious. And I fear among the many critiques out there is that it became mainstream too fast, too quickly, before it could thoroughly be understood and studied. So in other words, there is a general lack of empirical and applied work on the concept of precedence, which has largely remained wrapped in theoretical discussions. And this concern responds to the question posed by Korostoleva: are we sure we understand the concept of precedence well enough to make full use of its arresting potential? Thus, I embarked in the contentious issues to understand precedence through the eyes of local communities, their voices, memories, expectations, and daily practices. And by reformulating precedence, I have aimed to overcome identified conceptual puzzles, as I call them, or which I argue have constrained the scope and potential of precedence theory to address contemporary challenges. That is, despite more recent definitions of precedence in the literature allow for a much more adaptive and flexible approach to resilience, by which resilience can be achieved either by adapting to new situations or by creatively responding to new opportunities opened by a crisis. And this is in comparison to earlier approaches by which the emphasis was largely on the bouncing back or retaining the same system functioning and identity. So despite this advancement, there still are, in my opinion, some issues to be resolved. And these are an indissoluble link between resilience and crisis, for which resilience operates largely as a discourse of survival, yet under a self-reliance agenda. The persistence of linear and equilibrium thinking through bouncing analogies, and the existence of a dualism between insiders whose problems need to be solved and outsiders who propose solutions on the basis of an underlying impression of fragility of the targeted communities, which is portrayed by resilience programs. Thus, theoretically, I propose a critical reframing of resilience grounded on everyday life as negotiation of change in livelihood practices, skills, knowledges, identities, and material culture. As also argued in a recent, by Derbyshire, in a recent monograph about Turkana contemporary history, the picture which emerged is not one of stasis, but rather one of proactive building, strengthening, and growing by means of uncertainty and variability. Then if this is not resilience, then what else, really? So the book is deeply rooted in the context and case studies it offers. It draws on the case of Turkana herders in the northern Kenyan drylands, which is a place of resilience making for the international community threatened by recurrent droughts, security issues, a precarious living. Turkana County is the perfect laboratory for international organizations interested in building resilience to shocks and disasters, and in turn also a compelling case for a study which hopes to bring a more grounded, rooted, nuanced understanding of resilience in dry lands. So how is this work be structured? In the monograph to be, I show, and I won't go in much detail now because it's nothing too revolutionary. But anyway, I show that the dominant operationalization of resilience and international development lies in the field of disaster planning around three main areas of interest, which are considered particularly threatened by shocks and disasters. And these are the environment, livelihoods, and bodies, or safety in general. So these areas of interest then become typical dimensions of interventions of resilience programs, which I map out as a landscape, a lifescape, and a bodyscape component of development interventions, which for the case of pastoral development, this reflects mainstream views of existing pastoral problems that needs to be solved through nowadays resilience programming. And these are a pastoral problem of a fragile, unproductive, and remote environment, a pastoral problem of a mobile lifestyle and no longer viable livelihood, and a pastoral problem of insecurity. So based on long-term fieldwork, largely ethnographic and anthropological fieldwork, I examined local meanings of resilience across these dimensions and compare these with the interpretations emerging from policy documents, development interventions, and scholarship to see if a different narrative, a different perspective is possible. And I've done so following these main research questions. What do we learn about those components of pastoral development currently discussed under the label of resilience by switching perspective and following pastoralist lived experiences? And how does then this new understanding of resilience then relate to contemporary ideas of resilience in policy, practice, and scholarship? To what extent does it challenge, endorse, or even revolutionize it? So following this overarching framework, then the potential monograph is structured around these three themes of pastoral development to see, as I mentioned, if there is another alternative narrative possible. And I now try to go over briefly the three themes, providing a brief overview of the main claim I make for each. So the first theme, surveyed by the monograph, concerns the first pastoral problem, that of the lived environments, drylands, largely seen as fragile and a static nothingness, unproductive and remote. And I challenge this view by providing an ethnographic account of the disequilibria ecology literature, which grew around the ecological feature of variability, so the characteristic instability of dryland environment, which grew since the 80s. This work was incredibly important to reformulate pastoralism as working with and not against environmental variability by interfacing it with the variability in the production system, so through strategic mobility, communal tenure, herd adaptation, mechanism of reciprocity, etc. However, most of this work is very scientific. It concentrates on hard data, figures of remote sense vegetation, yields of natural forage, plant biomass, etc. And with few exceptions that do exist, anyway, little space remains in the literature for the knowledge on the ground, for the perceptions and understanding of herders of their own lived environment. I thus aim to contribute to this literature by adding details on the experience of variability, how it is perceived, how it is represented, what responses it fosters. And by so doing, I show that mobility is the lens through which the variability of the environment is locally experienced as the continual reconfiguration and reshaping of spatial features. So in other words, thanks to prolonged experience in Turkana, I came to understand the inherent dynamism of a variable environment as a fundamental quality of space rather than a sign of fragility, and ended up interpreting it as in terms of space mobility. In fact, my host showed to me a space which took on life. Earth and sky moved, rivers and underground flowing waters, plants, scenes, the wind, livestock and wild animals, land, soil and surfaces, everything moved. Space was never motionless. Plants engage and generate movement. Trees flex, rocks rolls, and mountains slides, and sand flows. The word breathe, Inggold would say. Yes, such liveliness of space only emerged by enlarging the ecological scale of analysis. So moving beyond the micro-zonal standard approach to space, which divides space in bounded zones and identify production systems within each of these zones, something called pointerism in geography, in which points, lines, maps dominate. While my hosts have taught me to see the coexistent heterogeneity of multiple spaces and multiple times as well, then make a territory at large, which is waved together by means of large-scale ecological or socio-ecological connectivity, which cross the many socio-ecological niche co-present in the territory. Then from these new acquired sites, so a large-scale ecology, the resources would no longer appear as scarce, which is the second assumption about drylands, but unevenly distributed and mobile as they grow and die and flower again in different places at different times in coevolution with the movement of its human and not human inhabitants. So important questions then won't any longer be how much of a resource there is, which would give a little informative average value, but will be where, when, for whom, for what purposes these resources are available. And these are all relational questions of accessibility, namely the capacity and possibility to reach, appropriate, and use resources for livestock and people, which is experienced at multiple levels. Which I frame as physical dimensions of space, so including landforms, terrain, distances, but then there are other dimensions, climatic dimensions, ecological dimensions, territorial, social dimensions, etc. Basically, these entail the possibility to reach pasture and forage, to be able to reach it physically with the herd, but also then the herd capacity to feed on it, and also the time when you reach it, because so to meet the highest nutritional value, but then also land tenure restrictions and social connections and the like. So if we accept this perspective, then we need to reconsider scarcity as a function of scale and the result of constrained access, of problems of accessibility, something that it was already claimed by Sen after the Sahelian drought at the end of the 70s, but is still not fully acknowledged in the policy documents which treat the problem of productivity of drylands. So then, as all these resources which we have seen are unevenly distributed and mobile, so since they move, then also these conditions of access would move. And therefore, these conditions of access as well can only be learned by moving, by wayfaring, by means of enskillment, as Ingot again would say. So by experience which is transmitted from generation to generation and is encoded in the environment through beliefs, amulets, and ritual life. I have to go down here. So for example, if there is a strong dusty wind, sometimes you could see people stretching their right arm and with the hand, shaking their hand, going, Tamam Kayaya, return to your land, go away, evil. They are talking to the devil carrying the wind, but they're also encoding in the wind its potential dangers through a shared performance. So teaching the noble herder what to be careful about, offering protection and strength towards crossing unpredictable spaces. And in this way, the environment becomes available also in symbolic terms, perceptually. So during fieldwork with Turkana herders was as if the variability of the landscape took on its own agency, deduced from the unpredictability of the land. And in response to this agency of space, Turkana herders have developed different scales of practices of divination to regain control over their land. Other examples would be rituals of rainmaking or rain forecasting, or a wide set of amulets used as protections. In all of these cases, place is encoded in these rituals and in the associated everyday practices that give people both individual and collective identity. These maps here show the different significance of emplacement between herders and outsiders in the representation of space, and transform remoteness, the third assumption about dryland, in belonging, becoming a site of grassroots resistance against modernization. So to wrap up the first theme very quickly, I suggest we abandon view of drylands or pastoral environment as fragile, scant, remote, as peripheral, to welcome large-scale approaches for which fragility is better framed in terms of long-term and large-scale mobility. Scarcity is a function of scale and the product of constrained access, and people's practices and relationship with place generate an alternative science, molding a sense of place and enabling a process of meaning generation for local residents, which is absent in outsiders' account of space, who are only able to see remoteness because for them development ends at the fringe of towns. Moving to the second theme, which is about the claim that pastoral livelihoods are no longer viable in face of recurrent challenges, including climate change, socioeconomic transformations, political instabilities, etc. Hence, often resilience programming falling under the lifescape component insists on diversification, adaptation, alternative livelihoods in order to support pastoralism, but end up, instead of strengthening it, often they end up transforming it into something else because somehow considered deemed to an end, and also somehow giving a static view of what pastoral livelihoods should look like. And I contest this view by showing how Turkana herders' capacities for refashioning, recreating, re-establishing core livelihoods, adjusting to and negotiating change in society and the environment. And I argue that mobility is crucial in this process of readjustment, and show mobility as a core element of everyday life, enabling livelihoods which are plural, relational, and spanning across multiple locations. So if for the earlier theme, I use mobility as a quality of space, now I use mobility as movements put in place, enacted to access resources which are unevenly distributed. And the relevance of these forms of movements largely strike in the context of everyday life, even though sometimes discursively represented as a struggle or as something people do not necessarily aspire to. Indeed, I was not always given by my host being on the move, conditions to beloved conditions. Moving is associated with many dangers. Often people narrate stories of migration with livestock or long walks to get food, aid, or cash from development programs, or exhausting marches with heavy luggage towards market towns with empathetic suffering. Days with no food and water, days of scorching sun, encounters with scorpions, snakes, hyenas, days of shame, needing to beg for food, getting lost, entering hostile communities, and so forth. And many have also shared with me the desire of wanting a settled house made of mud and iron sheets with permanent water feeding directly into everyone's hut, or markets in their village so that we do not have to walk long distances, or irrigation schemes to have our own farm and stop all this moving around. So I don't want to hide all of that, though much of it may also be the result of decades of propaganda, that settlement, of policies that say that settlement is a better living option, more modern and civilized, etc. And this may have very well shaped people's aspirations. But nonetheless, all this morning as well, all of my host families in the end do engage in complex forms of movement, which I have categorized according to my own conception. So what we follow is Heigler representation of my own observation and my own participation. It doesn't reflect local categories because they are in reality way more mixed up and responding to contingencies. So things that happen in the surrounding, responding to the logic of variability and uncertainty. And these are mobility in the environment, which is the easier to classify in a pastoral sector. It entails the human and livestock movement following grass, water, rail, following resources which we have seen move. It is performed to ensure the best possible diet for the livestock, who then transform grass into proteins for humans. And pastoralists are more concerned with quality than quantity. That's why the coping narrative about pastoral migration doesn't really tell what it is. also because they don't really move because of deteriorating local conditions, but because of the improvements of conditions elsewhere. So that wouldn't fit the standard definition of coping, as well as there is way more movements during the good season, the rainy season, than because a lot more things are happening than the bad season, the dry seasons. And one final point is that migration strategies are the product of both structural differences, so head compositions, labor availability, etc., as well as risk propensions or preferences. So there is great variation and heterogeneity between different households. So, and this also holds for the next forms of movements which I describe. The following one is, I called it kin mobility, so it's embedded in the social organization and performed in the domain of kinship. It explained the large part of my host movement, and is performed with the intent to build or maintain a relationship, and generally come with quest, promise, and responsibility. So I'm talking of those movements enacted to keep a network alive through, for example, the practice of sharing and visiting. So going to someone to gift, donate, creating a debt relationship, but also increasing one's own reputation and power. Or going to visit, which generally instead involve asking for something. Both forms of this movement can occur at a micro scale of neighborhood, as well as a large scale, when extended families or bond friends have dispersed in multiple locations. So this form of mobility is central to understand Turkana social organization, perhaps all pastoral societies, and perhaps all societies with a limited material culture. In these cases, in fact, the material and symbolic value of kin mobility is particularly important, supporting physical needs as well as processes of community creation. And the final forms of movements I'll talk today is economic mobility in the domain of the social economy. Then, as I mentioned earlier, these are in reality way more mixed up, and occurs through, for example, trading and participations into markets, or engaging into different production methods such as herding, fishing, farming, employment, etc., which entail relocating to a different locations and learning a new professional activity. Or also through networks of local forms of moral economy, I'd say, with small jobs offered from wealthier members of the community to poorer ones, like fetching water or building a hut. They call it commissioned work, for which people would get some food or cash to support their family, and entail a physical movement to meet a socioeconomic objective, which also contributes to community creation. So I'm definitely talking of the different forms of movement and more standard ideas of movements which entail a lot of decision making, mostly discussed as if these were permanent or long-term, forced, long distance, general, international. So I'm not talking about these forms of movement, which definitely exist, but there's also exist these other forms of movement, more quotidian, translocal, circular, back and forth, with a mix of coercion and choice, which risk going unnoticed, and most importantly, problematize conventional livelihood approaches. So resilience programs have fully endorsed livelihood language, mainly through the sustainable livelihood approach, which became prominent in the late 90s, but builds on livelihoods analysis that go back several decades before, and gives somehow dichotomic interpretations of people's lives: pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, fisher folks, farmers, urban dwellers, etc., with also a tendency to treat households as homogeneous and unproblematic units. And development thinking often remains in an old sectoral mode, with still too few policies nowadays recognizing different forms of pastoral mobilities than the search for pasture and water, with still too few policies considering other non-livestock activity shaping pastoral livelihoods. Or if these are considered, then they are framed in terms of adaptation, so maintenance, but modification of a core livelihood, diversification, so activities which are added on a core livelihood, or alternative livelihoods, moving out of the core livelihoods. And this forgets or ignores the considerable fluidity which exists between these categories, and which would only emerge if one broadens the scale of analysis at a wider socio-ecological and socio-economic scale, including different areas, different communities, different households. And at this large scale, mobility then works as a vector, enabling social, spatial, and socio-economic connectivity that serves to navigate contingency, namely change and variability in the surrounding. So a reflection about resilience here is that more than aiming at the sustainability of the boxed livelihoods, also the danger of increasing social fragmentation, livelihood resilience would be better framed as motion within motion, laying in the capacities of being mobile, navigating complex variabilities, and moving beyond the borders created by the act of labeling imposed upon human groupings. And by letting emerge all these forms of movements, livelihoods can no longer be taken in isolation, but rather as a webs of relationship that cannot be mapped in one single location, nor in one bounded entity. So seeing livelihoods not as absolute states, but relationally, as co-constituting each other and wave together into a broader livelihood net. In a multi-resource economy in which mobility is crucial to determine the degree of economic integration, social circulation, socio-ecological connectivity, as well as the degree of incorporation of complex forms of variability. Moving to the last theme, and then we'll conclude. In this theme addresses the concern about pastoral insecurities, and I focused on food insecurity, because indeed subject of food shortages, frequent food shortages, and frequent drought cycles, pastoral populations in drylands are often a priority for humanitarian interventions that usually involve the provision of food in kind, but increasingly also cash-based transfers. So in this context, food security, however measured, is often used as a proxy for resilience, which in turn is seen as a pathway to achieve the zero hunger goal under the Agenda for Sustainable Development. So food security plus its emotive counterpart, hunger, are common elements in resilience programs. And this is largely because they're conventionally seen as linked with the variability of the targeted population. So there is a link between food insecurity and vulnerability, which I do not necessarily want to contest. But I think it's important also to show that this is not necessarily what I've heard or what I've seen from the perspective of Turkana through the performance of their identity. This is how I get into the theme of pastoral identities, which is highly tied to food, as all of us, we all link our identities to what we eat and what we do not eat. And particularly, I believe it's particularly interesting that that happens also in places characterized by food shortages. So in a way, while certainly important, these humanitarian interventions bypass the experience of hunger, which in Turkana have shaped a flipped narrative of vulnerability, one which portrays town dwellers as insecure to the lack of food, while Turkana herders remain strong. So through the hunger, Turkana herders perform a distinctive collective identity called Vaya, or better, a sense of solidarity built around the feeling of belonging, which is built in opposition to urbanities, which are, or how the various social imaginaries think of the urbanities, which are seen as lazy and weak, spoiled and vulnerable, always crying, incapable of existence, only thinking about food. Conversely, Raya remark an identity characterized by ecological situateness, endurance, and capacity to stay without, which resonates against the images of poor and vulnerable herders commonly portrayed in policy documents. Now, framed under the conceptual underpinning of cultural resilience, various recent ethnographies have sought to pursue an analysis of resilience also in the social dimensions, which is otherwise overlooked, entirely overlooked in the scholarship, in the resilience scholarship. But these studies mainly look at the ways in which cultural traits survive despite a changing world, and finding manifestations of resilience in those cultural traits. So resilience is, in these studies, is still again somehow treated restrictively or conservatively, in my opinion, lingering on a tired dichotomy, tradition, modernity, that does not account for changes that occur within culture as well. Also, depicting pastoral strategies or identities as traditional meets also the risk of conveying a wrong message to policy makers, for example, by implying that their practices are habitual or immune to changes. So by looking at pastoral identities by using food as central analytical lens, the monograph to be wants to expand and contribute to this literature by showing that resilience rests in both. In the local identity, yes, in the local identities used as a social construct that gives meaning in a certain environment of belonging and solidarity, so in line with the other ethnographies, but also in its responsiveness to change and distinctive malleability, or in other words, in the mobility of identities. So far from being statically anchored to tradition, the book shows Turkana identities as flexible and accommodating change. So it goes, so after reviewing the traits of these two opposed social worlds, that of rural herders and urbanities, from the standpoint of Turkana herders only, and around dietary, fashion, or other convivial habits, which were presented to me quite definitively, to the extent of reaching also stereotypical characterizations of themselves, only eating milk, blood, and milk, and wild fruit, and disdain for everything that comes from town. And these images here were drawn during a focus group discussion about the representations of a Turkana woman and men. So after reviewing these traits, I then explore how these constructed identities were nonetheless malleable, polythetic, and fluid, or in other words, there is a lot of ambiguity between self-representations and actual and social practices. For example, these are all the objects that two shepherds brothers I was migrating with and their shots had with them, and included a pot and a discarded metal used to cook maize, as well as a plastic bag which contained maize and beans. And they explained to have bought the pot at a market and showed pride to have found the discarded metal next to an abandoned building site. So in this way, they were incorporating into their daily practices attires from the repertoire which belonged to their urban counterparts. And with resourcefulness, they were weaving together the two counterposed lifestyles in their social imaginary, at least. Another striking example was this one. This was the outfit of one of my hosts at the wedding of his son. He wore his favorite collared dark green shirt, exhibit these long, well-cared white feathers on the head, a black helado from the tail of an ox on his hands to shake during the dances, and then around his neck, this fuchsia garland, possibly found abandoned at the end of some other formal event, which makes me smile every time I see it. But I soon realized also how resourceful this gesture can appear. So the disdain of urban life was overcome with appropriation of attires and articles felt glamorous, such this improvised scarf, or practical, such the discarded metal used by the Shepherd brothers, and the capacity to select specific traits from the culture of the urban counterparts. And here I'm quoting Piaget, removing the meaning generally conveyed and replacing it with their own, show that the constructed social imaginary remains fundamentally open, polythetic, and with fuzzy word. Okay, so now I'm not really sure how to wrap up, but basically, from the three main dimensions of operationalization of resilience in the development industry, so the environment, livelihoods, and bodies, a shift to a local perspective have revealed the key role of mobility, a space which is mobile, a livelihood which is mobile and plural, an identity which is mobile and multiplex, which perhaps makes mobility a better analytical lens than bouncing to review, to understand resilience. And then after all this, all of this study and thinking about it, I think we are kind of left with three options, which were also discussed at the IUS in Poland, in a panel on resilience and pastoralism in 2019. And we are left with these three options, basically. Accept resilience dogmatically, apply it to various cases and see how it looks like. Abandon resilience, criticize resilience entirely in stark opposition with policymaker, or recreate and reconceptualize resilience with something more significant and adaptive to the lives of the people we are studying and working with. So learning from Turkana herders' capacities to navigate both contingency and social imaginaries, both characterized by high variability and changes that occur all the time, then I suppose we shall do the same. We shall push for a new model of international development that recognize that resilience is highly contextualized. It can only be seen or understood locally from the point of view of the studied actors, in this case by seeing like the herder, as opposed to the bird's view adopted by practitioners surveying the landscape from a distance. And also that resilience entails motions within motion, a way of navigation through a mobile social, ecological, economic, and cultural terrain, and it lies in the possibilities the movement opens. So unlike other approaches that retain a negative characterization of mobility, this book would go as far as proposing mobility as part of the solution, which I think is particularly timely and important because in a contemporary world of perpetual movement, incessant migrations, increasing uncertainty, etc., the understanding of mobility as a tool to manage variability might be crucial. And key to understanding of mobility is its role it plays for those who practice it as everyday livelihoods. So it thereby seems justified to me to begin this task by learning from nomadic pastoralists how to navigate and negotiate uncertainties. And this requires rethinking expertise, opening to diverse and local knowledge, and also an entirely different approach to governance, in being more flexible, in being more creative, and being more adaptive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greta. That's it.
Stop sharing. It became so dark where I am.
It has gotten a bit darker, I think, over the last
turned on the lights.
Blew the lights out with your talk. Thank you very much for a stimulating talk. And we are okay. We have some hand clapping emojis. They're excellent. Thank you. So with that, we'll open the floor to discussion, questions. Of course, these can take time to formulate sometimes. But seeing no hand up right now, I just have a quick question, and this refers actually to the abstract of your talk rather than the talk itself. But I apologize if it's out of left field to ask, but I was just very curious kind of what you meant in the abstract when you spoke of kaleidoscopic accounts of people's lives at the interface of an ever-changing and highly uncertain world. And I guess perhaps how does that kind of kaleidoscopic account fit into the kind of three-streamed approach that you have to discussing resilience and a rethinking of resilience?
Yeah, assuming that I know what kaleidoscopic in English exactly means, but what I implied is this fragment, this multiplicity of identities and livelihoods, which cannot be really boxed up in a specific category. So yeah, the fact that with the kaleidoscope you can break it up and changing also, so the many shapes and the changing shapes as well. Then the structure is it came up both ways. So as I was like the themes, the livelihoods, identities, and environmental theme came up at the same time, pretty much inductively. So they were recurrent things that I was finding in my dates and my diaries and my interviews. And then at the same time, I maybe biased by this lens, but I saw that most of the resilience programs are organized this way, either covering one or two or three or all of these elements. So then I crossed them and serves as more as a structure to go through the element. But in a way it was reassuring, meaning that these programs, it's not that they're entirely out of sense for the context. They do work in dimensions which are relevant for the people, because those were the same dimensions emerging from the conversation I was having. It's mainly the point of view and the objectives, the ultimate objective of interventions. That is problematic, I think.
Thank you. Jacques?
Yes, thanks for this talk, for this presentation. So I have two questions. The first one is, I'm not clear. I mean, it seems to me that your critique on resilience applies to, let's say, the buzzword, because resilience has turned to be a buzzword. It's everywhere with different meanings. But resilience is also something very much more specific, more specifically theorized. For example, the version of resilience I like and is Gunderson and Holling in the book Partnership, the way resilience is conceptualized in this book, I found interesting. And then there is a buzzword, and the buzzword is a mess. So it seems to me your critique applies to the mess, to the buzzword, but not necessarily to more specific, elaborated definition and conceptualization of resilience. So I would like to have your opinion. And do you draw a line between those, two ways to see resilience, as a buzzword or as a more sophisticated concept? And do you apply your critique to both? And the second question is what I think is very interesting in resilience, at least the version of resilience, like the one I was mentioning by Gunderson and Holling, is that it emphasizes the importance of change. A system that cannot change cannot be resilient. So, and you mentioned capacity for change as a key principle in a resilient system. So it seems to me that if you propose mobility, if we stuck on mobility in some way, that means, because it has to be mobility all the time. So then resilience offers changes, but mobility in some way doesn't offer change, because if you say, okay, pastoralism has to be mobile, and that's the way it is, and it has to be, what if someday, what if in certain circumstances, mobility was not the future of pastoralism? And I don't know Turkana, but there are places in Kenya where actually we can start to doubt whether the future relies on mobility or whether it relies on something else. What else? Well, if the system is resilient, it may find the what else. But if you're stuck on mobility, then you will not find the what else, and you are stuck and you cannot change. So your feedback or your comments on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, thank you. So about the first question, so indeed, I'm much like I've liked the evolution in resilience thinking that went towards the more adaptive and flexible and incorporate transform. So I would say that on the more scientific side, there are these two approaches, one which is more restrictive, which is a bit updated, which is the bouncing back, and then there is the more transformative, we can call it, approach to resilience, which does include this, switching to new, now the word escapes me, but yeah, it includes change and the possibility to adapt and modify to new states and etc. So I'm much closer to that approach indeed, but I don't know if my critique is only limited to the buzzword. So I think that like my critique concentrates on the way it is used in the development sector, regardless being a buzzword or not, the way that the development sector, despite advancements or progress in the resilience theory in the scholarship, then the way it is operationalized, and even despite the declaration or the definition or the general principles of these organizations, then when you go and see how it is operationalized and put in practice, problems in the way resilience is translated into practice remain. Mm-hmm. But then also then I don't know, maybe you want to correct me, yeah? But a problem I had, which I mentioned, so is this particular attention of resilience only in these circumstances of the crisis? So also in the Guland and Holling and etc. evolutions of the resilience, there is still analysis which is very much crisis biased, while isn't resilience built before the crisis? Before we are resilient, and then there is the crisis, and we can heal and and recover and withstand and jump. So methodologically, what I've tried to do, and perhaps is the critique I can also pose to that approach, is to look at resilience even in the everyday, so beyond the element, beyond the shadows of the crisis, or beyond using the crisis as the only analytical lens to understand people behavior, I think. And about the mobility being static, that would be a very funny turnaround of my thing. I didn't think of that, and I absolutely don't want to convey that message. I think I'm not doing it in the sense that I'm not talking of mobility only as migration. Is mobility also as connections? So those connections or networks, so those connections that enable you to stay put, but as if you are mobile, maybe because you have members of the extended households who are moving while you stay, but in a way you are also moving because you receive remittances, informations, exchanges reciprocally. So I'm broadening up the understanding of mobility, not just to the physical dimensions, but also to connections, and also this idea of changing identities, adapting livelihoods. So with this frame, I hope that I wouldn't end up conveying a message of mobility as something static, which is rather the opposite I wish to do. But thank you for pointing out. I'll try to make sure that's not the message.
Thanks, Jacques, for your question, and Greta for your answer. Claire, I saw that there was a little yes signal. Was that you have a question, or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I press the wrong button?
I mean, here we are, and you're asking a question, so the right button was pressed.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Greta. That was really lovely to hear all of this. And so I was wondering, first on the concept of resilience, is there a Turkana word for resilience? You know, what would be, you're interested in Turkana views, you know, so that would be nice to hear what, if anything, it might mean from your host family's point of view. And I would like to understand more about who were your host family, how did you get there, what kind of data did you have? Maybe you've done it, probably you've done a lot of this, and you will be doing a lot of that in the monograph, but I think it would be really useful to have that background. So my question really is to do with how things might have changed from, I mean, I was in Turkana in 1985, just after a horrible big drought. And recently I've been reading letters from a friend of mine who was a trainee doctor who was in Turkana in the 70s. So, you know, all of this is going back a bit, but I'm trying to understand, it all sounds so familiar. You know, what has changed? It all sounds like what we were already understanding in those many decades ago. And so one way of answering that might be, in your host family, maybe you had people as old as me, I'm 71, you know, how would they look back to these decades? And how would they see any changes? You know, there wasn't the concept of resilience then, there was sustainability, or it was coming in. But, you know, I can't see the difference between any of these terms. But how would your host family, the older members, how might they see the change and where we've got to now? And, you know, what are the problems today that are so different from the past? There you are.
Yeah, thank you. So I started, so I'm trained as an economist, and then I end up doing all these things. So it was a bit difficult.
There's no problem. It's lovely to have an economist doing these things.
So I started actually very systematically with a whole like explorative initial phase, but aimed at eventually developing a survey. And in this initial phase, I was asking the questions: what does resilience mean for you? How would you say it? I had a way more structured approach, which it got very frustrating at some point, and then I make the whole transformation. But some answers in the end, after retrospectively, when I went back, like when I was actually analyzing the data and such, I realized that some useful information was there. And one of it was this expression they frequently use, which is now I don't even remember, Anakingi-chan, something like that, which is more related to enduring, so this being skillful in resolving problems or going through, had this meaning, which was what they were largely relying on when I was asking this question. And then they would go with the example, like with the stories for hours, describing the most horrible droughts when they had to, you know, eat livestock skin, soaking it in water, and then sending their children, all these tragedies. And then they say, but we went through. This is resilient. But from these narratives, it wasn't like they were tragedies, but it wasn't the tragedy which was emerging from the way they were recalling. Actually, it was a lot of humor, and so that is something that has this more, and that's what then pushed me to do this identity, like something identitary of belonging, and also being from there, knowing the place. I can't go through like children. I also saw this relationship as they were treating me as a young child, and then young children in pastoral settings who are not really, they're not taking much into consideration. They count very little because they haven't learned yet. They haven't gone through yet as us. So I think something around that, which I try to incorporate in these identity discourses. About the host families and then data, and then I would maybe we'll chat separately how much of this would go in a monograph. I'm still not sure because they told me to remove the methodology chapter, which is my most favorite chapter. But then
no, definitely not. But just to get an idea, I mean, you have a method to interpret certain data, so it would be really nice to know what kind of data have you got. How did you collect it?
And these informations do go in a monograph in the end somehow.
Yeah.
Okay. So I called my approach a nomadic approach to research because it entailed a lot of changes and adaptation, exactly from starting from this economic goal and then ending up closer to an ethnography. Then I haven't learned Turkana language, so there are limitations also in coding it in ethnography, I suppose. I have mapped out 3 locations. So I've excluded the north and the south of the county because they weren't safe. So I remained on the central area of Turkana and then mapped along a geographical gradient, sort of from the mountains in Uganda to the lowlands and the lake, 3 field sites, capturing what it looked to me different sociologies and different livelihoods, etc. So to have sort of variation in each village, and then in each of the zones I would map a village. I would spend some time first in the village hosted by the chief, so having all that bias coming from there, but the time to get acquainted and to also spread the rumors that I'm there so that people know. And then at that time I was doing this more economic oriented approach. Then when I changed, then I said, I realized I wasn't really understanding much of the life of the people, because I was living with the chief, I wasn't living with them. So then I asked if I could, I developed this will to go and live with someone. And so then the selection process was like, I need someone who the chief would agree, because otherwise there would be some sort of clash. And it's someone who is relatively well off, even though I would bring food, of course, and some contribution, but then I didn't want to be excessively a burden. And then I also decided to go to some families that I had met already, doing interviews or hanging around, and we got along. Like we had some sort of good relationship to start with. And then, so in each of these sites, I had a host family, and all the second round of fieldworks, I just spent time with the host family. So there was purely participant observation, living with them, doing whatever they were doing, taking notes. I kept on doing some interviews and some focus groups when I had things I really liked, the representations of the wealth in Turkana. So we did these sort of activities, but otherwise it became really much about staying with them, which implied also a lot of moving for some families, for others not. Things change. I suppose that I think things have changed a lot also like from my beginning of fieldwork to the end. So I can't imagine how different it can be from here before. Because like when I started, they had just opened the airport. So in Turkana County, a lot is happening from a point of view of economy, you know, there is a lot of attention. Now is a year that I don't really know, of course, this funny year that we are living. But before this, there was a lot of interest growing and money flowing, and with the oil, and then the activism against the mega dam that they're building on the Omo River, and then the wind power, and then the largest aquifer in the world, they found it in Turkana, of course, and then the refugee camps. So it's changing, but I do imagine that some of these things, also because with the Terence McCabe, we did a book review together on the book of Derbyshire, and also with him in doing this exercise that we did of an exchange, or a letter exchange between us, we could see that, you know, some of the things are recurrent, are still there. And so that's an interesting question that perhaps needs a bit more reflection. They would, from my host, I would get multiple impressions. Some would be, you know, they would say the survivors of the new skills. So those who are not going to schools, those who are not learned, those who have not adapted to the new lifestyle. So they do recognize that there is a new lifestyle, and they make this comparison. But those who don't do that, they grow thin. So they struggle. So there is a bit of this fear. But these are so like my mothers, or my host mothers, my host fathers, so the older generation. And the young generations, again, some conflictual, because those who went to school may have been more, you know, greater aspirations, but then those who do not go to school develop some sort of antagonism against the brothers who went to school.
Yeah, all very familiar, except at the time it wasn't the dam, it was the fishing project. But anyway, thank you very much for your answers, and I loved your photos.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much, Claire, for the great questions, and also the pertinent comment. I agree. The photos were excellent, and thanks, Greta, for your wonderful answer. Before moving on to John, I just want to have one quick comment about something that was part of your answer, Greta. That when you were talking about resilience being sort of perhaps somewhat translated as moving through, getting through, and when you were talking about children, you know, how they have not yet gone through. They have not yet learned. I find it very interesting, and not only kind of highlighting the connection sometimes between, you know, figuring out one's way through hardship and learning, or, you know, experimenting, messing up and learning, but also perhaps an important kind of connection between resilience and learning itself. Learning could very well be a very important part of resilience. And of course, then, you know, learning on the move, learning and mobility go well together, especially if you're, you know, coming from drawing on Ingold in any fashion, but yeah, not only him. Excellent. Well, John, you have the floor.
Thanks, Nick. Greta, this is a wonderful presentation. I thought it was full of creative ideas and sort of coming across material that many of us here are quite familiar with in new ways. So I love the way you stirred the pot, especially with regard to resilience and that conceptualization. I want to make two comments and a question. One comment has to do with my appreciation of your expansion of the notion of mobility by looking at it not just as spatial mobility and the management of herds and movement of households, but also having to do with social relations, political relations. It seemed to me that that gives you some access to grappling with the question that Jacques Pollini posed, which was if the spatial mobility begins to sort of temper down because of various types of constraints, you've actually sort of anticipated that problem in the maintenance of mobility in different ways to, in effect, achieve greater resiliency or to maintain resiliency by these other modalities. So I very much liked your approach to mobility. On livelihoods, we've those of us who've been tracking the Turkana literature for, what is it, half a century, going back to some of the literature from the 40s and the 50s, and then of course the STEP project and all of their marvelous work, etc. The whole question of pastoralism in the setting of diverse livelihoods is so important. The Turkanas are pastoralists, yes, but they're fishing, and they are also farming along the Turk well, and they're hunting. They're doing all kinds of things, and that was built into the nature of the pastoral adaptation from a very long time ago. So I wanted to express my appreciation of your sense of the historical nature of the evolution of livelihood diversity. And now, of course, you find things arising that didn't exist a while ago. That sort of speaks to Claire's point a bit. But my question is, you've just enumerated a whole series of things. So if we want to talk about Turkana today, we're going to talk about oil. We're going to talk about the wind farms. We're going to talk about conflicts, this enormous refugee camp, which, by the way, I just read a couple of days ago, they're going to dismantle. To what effect, I don't know. There are all these things going on. The emergence of county governance, which means you have a whole echelon of civil servants who actually are from the place. Do you see your strategies of approaching livelihoods and mobility, which are just the two that I focused on, as providing tools for trying to grapple with the effects of these sort of global level impositions and interventions in the life of the Turkana region?
I hope so. Yeah, this new of the refugee policy in Kenya, it's not the first time they do. So hopefully, as the other times, nothing will necessarily happen, but it's already it's nonetheless impacting a lot. Like it's destabilizing, and people are, I know someone who has had already, or someone who has closed up a business because like they're shutting up. So yeah, maybe that's part of the uncertainty though that we should all learn. So I suppose so. So maybe this is the point. This is the point in. So there's little maneuver because structurally and institutionally, it's really difficult to really embrace as a society these elements of mobility, flexibility, adaptability, changing. But I do hope, like at least from learning, like I do see these as elements for the Turkana people, if they could act this way, as important tools to respond to these changes. But then there is a part of me which is a bit more pessimistic that says structurally there's going to be a clash because aspirations then are changing, and real possibilities of being as flexible as one wants to be will be constrained. Now with like COVID, not much in Turkana, but in other boundaries, regions of Kenya, they have been stopped a lot, or like with the markets connections being interrupted because of COVID, it is having a lot of impact. But the hope would be to remain positive is that by embracing a more mobile in this broader understanding of mobility and a more flexible approach to livelihoods, we could find some ways to navigate these elements. It's just that it's a collective work.
Thank you.
As we started I believe we started today's talk with talking about how we sometimes think we're unmuted or muted. Terrence, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to just mention when we were talking about resilience, I remember one of the things that the ecologist had said on the Turkana project, that the Turkana were in a persistent but non-equilibrium system. And, you know, that was in the 80s. And I think if we were doing it now, we would say it's a resilient system. So we were saying the same things a long time ago, but using different words. The thing that when I think about resilience, and I think about resilience, especially with Turkana, I see two things. One of them is mobility. I mean, the actual mobility. And I think that if you really reduced mobility, you could still raise animals, but I think you would actually be in a different system. So the whole point of part of the resilience theory is that you will cross a threshold and you will enter into a new system. So not that you can't live in that new system, but I think you would be in a new system. The other aspect that I think is critical is the social organization of Turkana. The social organization of Turkana is, I know you've read about it, but they have these gigantic horizontal connections through which goods, labor, people all move around. And the two big crises that have to be dealt with are drought and raiding. And animals have to move around, among families. And they do that. I think that's one of the critical components of resilience in Turkana, has to do with the way the social organization operates. And I think if those connections were reduced, you would also have a different system. I would suspect you would have a much more stratified system in terms of social organization. So, that's just the way I think about it. Also, and I can tell you that Nick had mentioned learning. One of the things that struck me, Turkana have a tendency to lie about nearly everything all the time. And I can remember going with a bunch of people to map some water holes. And I watched as these guys went down towards the water holes and they wanted to know about grazing in the local area. And they didn't ask the adults, they were asking the kids, which I thought was crazy because the kids aren't going to know as much as the adults. And when I asked them, I said, so what are you doing? Why are you asking these kids these questions? They said, oh, well, they haven't learned how to lie yet. So keeping information to yourself that's critical could be part of resilience and as part of learning. And in this case, they were showing that lying is a critical component about that. You don't tell other people what the state of your grazing is in your area in order to keep people from just moving in when they want to. So I just wanted to make those two comments. And like John had said, two of the things that you didn't mention, but seem to be common are oil and wind farms and things like that. I didn't hear you say anything about raiding either, which certainly when we were working there, raiding was a very, very big deal.
And actually, the second round of fieldwork was in 2017 during the last drought. and during the official peak, which then I don't know what it means because it was the drought even before and after. But anyway, I was on the escarpment on the border between Turkana and Uganda. So that was the only moment, because then otherwise maybe it wasn't shared to me that much because I'm a woman, or when I was more central, maybe it's not anymore such a big, I don't know. But like that time, at the border with Uganda, it became definitely the depressing theme. And like every night we would talk of the footprints of the enemies that were seen in the surrounding, or the attack we've been done over there, and it became a bit worrying. Thank you for this comment. I actually, then I see there is another question, but I would like at some point to pose a question to John Garrett, because I've read the papers you circulated before, and one is submitted to a special issue or something, and you do talk of some grazing of fencing, ranching, new approach, like different model in Masai. And I was interested to know, right, because you had a positive interpretation of it, which I would be interested to know. I didn't know that was being done still. And then
It takes us a little bit far afield to pull in the Maasai, but certainly there are experiments in ranching. There are things that they call ranching, like group ranches, which in some sense are don't really function like ranches. And then there are ways of fencing and carrying out intensified production, which I think is the sort of thing that Terry was alluding a few minutes ago. And of course, this opens up a very interesting set of topics that would take us far afield, but we could certainly interact over email about some of these dynamics going on elsewhere, where they're Maasai.
Yeah, I found it interesting and surprising at the same time. So yeah. You're muted again, Nick.
Thanks. That was fun. Thank you. And also, Terrence, just one little comment on your comment. The sort of notion of lying being part of resilience. I know that at least among reindeer herders in northern Mongolia, secrecy, which at some points involves lying. Sometimes it involves rather just a lack of putting some information out there, or kind of euphemisms, things of the sort. But secrecy, both in terms of your way of speaking and also your actual way of moving through the land, is a very important part of resilience, especially considering living in a national park where there can be regulations that make livelihood practices illegal. So a very good, a very salient contribution. Thank you. Okay, so we had actually a question from Ramson. I see that Ikal, you have your hand up. I was also wondering if Harold had the hand up earlier, but for now we'll go with Ramson and then Ikal, and then we'll move on from there.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. It's not actually a question mostly. I think it is a comment on resilience about in the pastoral setup. I think to me, mobility is like I think pastoralists are resilient, mobile in nature. And I think resilience in terms of mobility to me comes in a different way, the way I can see, because for you to be resilient, you have to adapt change. And to adapt change, I think in this case, I think there are a lot of challenges that face pastoralists when they are moving from one place to another. So to be resilient is, to me, I think, is to adapt the kind of challenges that you are going to face when you go to new environments. And for example, because we are also mobile in this area, and I see the Samburus move to other areas for resources, like natural resources, water, and pasture. They have to change and adapt in a way that if you are going in small numbers, then you have to go as a group, a team of, let's say, like maybe 10,000 people with 500 warriors who are equipped to defend their livestock and to defend their their lives, to be able to get the grass maybe at the border areas with the neighboring conflicting groups, with that in areas where conflicts really occur. In other areas, we also see pastoralists also move in numbers, and maybe in those areas there are no conflicts, but maybe they enter into private areas like conservancies. And having a lot of people, you know, the government will also come in different ways, either to evict them or to give them a chance to do negotiations and have to get the grass maybe from the conservants. So I think, to me, I see, yes, mobility can be resilient, but with adaptation of new changes to be able to exploit the resources in maybe hard to access areas of borders of disputed lands. Thank you.
Thank you. Agreed. Like I see, like I maybe I was also reading the discussion in the chat. I think a thin difference could be resilience as this capacity for change. So in your words, this adaptation or to new circumstances and changing some strategies, etc. And mobility being the tool to do that, the means. Mobility broadly understood again. In this case, you were talking of spatial mobility, but then there are other forms which could be seen as mobility as a tool, as the means to develop or to achieve this adaptation of change I'm talking about, or to develop this capacity for change in the way I framed it. But yeah, I agree with your point.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have Ikal followed by Justin.
Thanks, Greta, for the presentation. I actually am sitting in Turkana as I'm listening to you. So I'd be quite interested in, because the time when Terence was doing his research, that's the time population of pastoralists was about, what, 90%. Now the numbers are around 70% pure pastoralists. And then with a time when we have, adding to everything else that John and Terence had mentioned about what's happening here, at a time when there is this huge push for what is claimed as secure tenure, implementation of the Community Land Act, and the way it is being done is ignoring territories that, you know, the 16 territories that we have in Turkana, but a focus on administrative boundaries that are being used for creating what is the titles, quote unquote, for the Community Land Act. So it would be really interesting to see and start to think about how that informs or influences the mobility in a time also that the county government is doing the urban planning. So you have the new 9 urban centers, and the radius of it is cutting into areas that were migratory zones, you know, from Turkana West, the north, going all the way to Kerio during the different seasons, and how that has been impacted and will continue to be impacted. But even at the time with with now this new titling and what it means for the social relations, the political economy, and the social organization that Terence was referring to, as we think about resilience, but also considering the buzzword that Jack was talking about, and how that buzzword is now being used by elites within Turkana to then push it, because that's, you have resilience in a proposal, that's what gets you a grant to do work in this region. It'll be really interesting just to see, or if then your research is looking to just also look at the internal use of resilience within, whether it is government programs and projects. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is very interesting. I haven't done so when I was there. I'm not sure I was. I actually think I did at the time. I was doing this control F check in the development plan of 2013-2017, or the county atlas, which was also issued of disasters, which was also issued in those years I was there, and it wasn't used that much locally from the government or elites at the time. Interesting to know that now it is, and I would definitely be keen in saying how and where and etc. So thank you for sharing that. I absolutely agree with everything you said, and again, and I think that the impact of these things, both the Communal Land Act, the urban planning that has now been put in place, of which I don't know much, but I can guess, and the impact that you said in terms of social relations in limiting the mobility is going to be detrimental, and with a whole range of back effects, which will be dealt with a long time afterwards. So I wonder what a question would then be, why you keep on talking of mobility, that mobility is going to be more and more restrained, because it is going to be the effect of these policies in the end. But I do think it's important, because I do think that we have still to convince policymakers for real. And the examples are bringing are interesting, because at a more regional or international level, we have the African Union, who has the pastoralism policy framework, or the IGAD, who has accepted this protocol on transhumance. So there are international or regional African discourses on, safeguarding the mobility, even like more simply understood as spatial movement, because the value is being recognized, etc. Then you go locally at a very local level, and there is plenty of policy objectives which are conflicting, and therefore in the end these forms of mobility are constrained. I've also heard that moving from a county to another now with this communal act entails, for example, a fine, if I'm not mistaken, if you move, which, how you can guarantee the free access, the cross-border mobility as it is done in the transhumance protocol now, but then if you move from Turkana to Pocata, Stamburo, from Marsabit to, then you're paying a fine, or you're not, you're imposing again some institutional layers or administrative layers which do not correspond with your practices. So the long-term impacts I'm not very positive about. On the other hand, I do think it's important to keep on claiming that is an efficient and well thought and developed livelihood system, social systems, political system. That doesn't mean that it has to remain the same forever. It is evolving, it is changing, but it's worth at least a word to say in this policy development, I think.
Thank you very much, both to you, Ikal, and to you, Greta. Now, Dustin, you have the floor.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you, Greta, for this very productive discussion. I've enjoyed it quite a lot. I wanted to take up again the concept of resilience, sort of touching on something Terry and Jacques were alluding to. And we've been talking a lot about it in terms of the capacity to change. But I think, I think what Jacques was sort of getting at is and Terry as well, is that if we sort of take that too far, I mean, we're all resilient in a sense that we have capacity to change, right? I don't have to adapt to -40-degree winters, and I can get on a plane and go somewhere warm. And would that be resilient? I don't think so, in a sense. I think there's some element as well that we should keep in mind always, which is the capacity to endure, right? There's some element of a capacity to stay the same, and it's in relation to the capacity to change, and that is being able to live in these challenging conditions where some aspect of adaptability and ability to change is built into that. But if we just talk in terms of change, I think what Jacques is suggesting is then we can go off in all kinds of different ways, and it's not really resilient in a sense. That's sort of my comment. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you, and it's good to think about it in these terms as well. My instinctual reaction when you said that was that perhaps it's limited in scale, especially temporally, what you are mentioning. Like I in a broader long-term perspective, I really don't see this being this remaining, staying the same as a matter of fact in reality. So right now we have to endure. So there is this endurance. But perhaps if we broaden the scale, either geographically or temporally, which was the first thing that came to mind, that wouldn't necessarily be resilient, because it's not what it is. Thinking also of the David Attenborough last documentary and the whole discussions on the variability, which has reduced worldwide, like not just in the drylands. It's not just drylands are variable. We used to be all variable, so now we are all way less variable because there is way more stability over, and this is having long-term devastating impact, which we are now starting to see, but were not imaginable maybe long time ago. But yeah, thank you again. Think about that.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Justin, for your contribution. I, for one, really enjoy talking about perdurance as a sort of touching upon endurance, but not necessarily implying really kind of some, not to say that endurance is kind of a struggle against something, but perdurance, lasting by any means necessary kind of thing. Well, that was a very stimulating, engaging conversation following your equally stimulating and engaging presentation, Greta. I have a knack, I could ask other questions, but I have a knack for just stretching things beyond how they necessarily need to last. But I just got to say one comment. At one point in one of your slides, you had an image. I actually was trying to remember what it was exactly or what it was about, but kind of like a topographic-ish map, kind of drawing points and lines together. Whatever you were conveying at the time, it worked very well because that struck with me. Now I completely forget, but I think that's more my fault than yours. But I like that kind of graphism and thinking. Perhaps someone might have another question as I ramble on for just a moment, but oh yeah, John. All right, before I ramble on, please, John, take the floor.
No.
And Greta is, thank you again, Greta, for helping us realize we're on mute. So you're muted, John. So John, if you could just click unmute.
Sorry, I just wanted to make a comment about how the Zoom technology, bless their hearts, they're making a lot of money off this, but they've allowed us to have this sort of transatlantic and the cross-continental discussion. And I especially appreciate Silicon and Ekal and Ramson for maybe there are more for coming in from Kenya, but we're able to have a much broader discussion. If we didn't have this capacity, we would probably be a group of 10 at our research center having a discussion of a talk, and I think it's marvelous. And thanks, Greta, for this wonderful talk that opens so many different doors to discussion, critique, and for all of us to learn. Sorry, Nick, just back to you.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, thank you. I wholeheartedly agree. So does Caroline. So yeah, thank you. And just a heads up that we have 2 remaining talks for this season's speaker series. April 9th, Elise Imre Papineau, who is a PhD candidate in the Languages and Social Sciences Department at Griffith University, will be presenting a talk entitled "Unpacking the Activist Researcher Dilemma: Perspectives from Australia in Navigating Precarity, Security, and Responsibility Among Grassroots Activists." And then the ultimate talk of the season, which I've been looking forward to for months, will be Justin's talk. So Justin Ray Kraft, who's in attendance today, April 16th, Justin, who's a PhD candidate at McGill University, will be presenting a talk, at least tentatively entitled, but perhaps that will remain the title. It will endure the emergence of community support for conservation in the Maasai Steppe, Tanzania. So posters with links will be sent out, those through various channels. If you desire to join the mailing list for STandD activities, please just let us know in the chat, or if not, we can perhaps, Carmen, if you can just write the STandD email, please, because you know it better, in the group chat, that would be great. And that's how you could get looped in for more. If not, either or, have a wonderful rest of the day. And a thank you again very much for having attended, and feel free to linger on and discuss. Yeah, I think that this ends the event officially. So thank you very much again. And special thanks, of course, to Greta for having shared her time and thoughts with us and images. And this has been an excellent and very invigorating talk. So again, thank you, and cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah.